Welcome, everyone. We'll get started in just a few minutes. All right, Bethany, take it away.
Hey everybody, welcome and thank you for joining us for this webinar about our Emerging Research Workshop report using big data and algorithms to foster equity in STEM. I'm Bethany Farmer, I'm the Community Librarian for the ARC Network. And before we introduce today's guests, I would like to take care of a few housekeeping items. And first, I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and we will share the recording with registrants and post it to our ARC Network website. Live captioning is available through Zoom. If you hover your mouse over the bottom of the Zoom window, you'll see a number of different menu options. To the right is the icon for captioning. Selecting the caret will allow you to customize your captioning. In the center are options for Q&A and chat. For the beginning of our webinar, you will only be able to view the chat messages from the ARC team. We will also use the chat to share links to resources and our feedback survey. We will open the chat for participants once we finish with the prompted part of our discussion. If you have questions for the speakers, please add them to the Q&A, and you can also upvote questions. Next, Virginia Rhodes, ARC Network's project director, will share more about who we are as the ARC Network. Thanks.
Thanks, Bethany, and hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. The ARC Network is funded by the National Science Foundation's Advanced Program, and building on NSF Advanced Program efforts, the ARC Network aims to connect widely dispersed scholars and practitioners committed to STEM equity and an engaged stakeholder community. As the STEM Equity Brain Trust, the ARC Network works to promote systemic change by collecting previous work and producing new perspectives, methods, and interventions through convenings, a curated resource library, emerging research workshops, a virtual visiting scholar program, and online events such as this one. The ARC Network is built on and works through a framework integrating inclusion, intersectionality, and intentionality, and we strive to ensure that our work accounts for the social stratifications that intertwine to determine the unique inequities that other folks experience. The Women in Engineering Proactive Network, or WEPAN, serves as our home organization. And to learn more about the ARC Network, we encourage you to visit equityinstem.org, where you can also join our community if you haven't already. You can also find us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter at ARC Equity in STEM and with the hashtag Equity in STEM. Now, ARC Network's PI, Heather Metcalf, will briefly introduce our speakers and moderate today's discussion.
Thank you, Virginia, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Today, we're joined by a number of different scholars who focus on the topic at hand of big data and algorithms and how we can use them to foster equity in STEM. It's my pleasure to introduce each of our panelists to you today. First is Joan Herbers, Professor and Dean Emeritus at Ohio State University, as well as co-PI of the ARC Network. She chairs the ARC Network Research Advisory Board, which oversees the Emerging Research Workshop series. Herbers has authored 2 books, one on part-time tenure track positions and on academic commercialization. Maria Goldstein is a psycholinguist. She is currently doing a postdoc at Arizona State University. Some of the topics she is currently researching include algorithmic bias in automated writing evaluation and the improvement of demographic data collection practices to better represent inter and intra-categorical variance in demographic variables and intersectionality. Gerald Markey's research spans the field of labor economics, industrial organization, and the economics of science and innovation. His current research focuses on the scientific and engineering workforce. He's an associate professor of economics at the University of Albany and holds a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago. Lastly, we have Beth Michnek. who's currently Professor Emerita in the School of Geography and Development at the University of Arizona. She's held numerous administrative positions, including most recently Vice Provost for Faculty Success at the University of Massachusetts at Lowell and the University of Arizona Associate Dean for Academic Affairs of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences, Interim Vice Provost for Academic Affairs, Interim Dean and Faculty Associate to the Provost for the North Central Accreditation. She was also the lead program officer for the National Science Foundation's advanced program to promote gender equity in academic STEM. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today. And let's jump right into our first question. So the first question is for Joan. Joan, as chair of the ARC Research Board and co-PI on the grant, can you tell us a bit more about the emerging research workshops and how this topic came to be?
Sure. Thank you, Heather, and thanks to everybody who's organizing the webinar. Our emerging research workshops are designed to develop research and policy agendas for topics that are critical to advancing intersectional equity in STEM, but which have not yet been fully explored. These forward-thinking workshops convene about 25 experts in research, policy, and intervention strategies for 2 days of facilitated deliberations and discussions. Thereafter, we develop a detailed concept paper which identifies important areas for future work, as well as consideration for how that work might proceed. Topics for the workshops themselves are identified by our Research Advisory Board, an outstanding group of scholars, administrators, and policymakers. The Research Advisory Board identified today's topic because analyses of big data and algorithms can perpetuate inequity, discrimination, and even violence against people from marginalized communities. For example, the instance of facial recognition software being abused and misused is pretty well known. After we identified the topic, we identified a planning committee to develop an invitation list, and thereafter worked out a detailed plan for the workshop itself, which was held in December 2022. The concept paper is available to you, and we encourage you to read the full report, which can be downloaded from the ARC website.
Thank you, Joan. The report from the Emerging Research Workshop shares a few examples of how big data and algorithms, as they're currently and commonly structured, perpetuate inequities in STEM. As Joan mentioned in her remarks, facial recognition software is one example. Facial recognition software is used in so many places to unlock cell phones, for passenger airport screening, and employment decisions, rideshare applications, and for law enforcement surveillance. Research raises not only privacy issues about the software, but shows that it dangerously and consistently has the poorest accuracy when it's used to identify the faces of Black women. Panelists, can you share a few other examples with us of how big data and algorithms can and have perpetuated inequities in STEM?
Let me ask Beth to answer first.
Thank you, Joan. I was thinking that you would ask me first. There are a number of different ways, and from my perspective, the lens that I use is around faculty issues and faculty evaluation and hiring and advancement. And we use AI systems at a very basic level to parse out whose CVs are the best for us to look at. And so what gets programmed into those algorithms is a very particular meaning of success and excellence in the academy. And that very particular meaning is conventional. It often leaves out many of the kinds of activities that women faculty, and particularly women of color faculty and men of color, that they value and that they want to highlight on their CVs. So some of that gets erased when we use the big data systems to parse out who gets what, if you will, and who is considered successful and what's excellence. So I'll give you a very short example that had people laughing and crying at the same time. So a couple of years ago, Reuters decided to determine who were the biggest most important climate scientists in the US. And what did they do? They went to citation indices, which, as we all know, or I believe, that all of these biases roll up into citation indices, and they're considered to be sacred because they're numbers, so we have to believe them. So Reuters published the top 100 climate scientists, and guess what? About 90% of them were male or more. And in addition to that, a number of the people who were assigned a male identity using the big data were actually women. So this system of big data were used to identify who the major scholars are and then apportion to gender. So right away, we have women who were assigned a male gender. We ignore the binary, and we're using something called dodgy data, big data, to determine who's excellence and who's more productive.
Thanks, Beth. Maria, can you give another example?
Sure. So there is some research on how citations and likelihood of being published are skewed towards men in STEM and in academia in general. And in addition to that, as Beth mentioned, when taking into account, when using algorithms to figure out who should be promoted, who should get tenure, the variables used to make that decision don't fully reflect one's activities and career. And often things that women are more likely to do, like community outreach, like more applied things that aren't just translating things you care about into your actual research, don't get considered or rewarded in any way. So for me personally, to help advance my career, to do things that I care about, to create positive change or positive effects in people's lives and not just publish research, I need to kind of harness anything I'm doing that I care about into publishable research. Otherwise, it will just be things I'm doing for fun and don't really help me get a job. And yeah, it's kind of a struggle, I guess. And yeah, it's kind of weird to figure out how doing something positive needs to be somewhat commodified and not monetized per se, but like academically monetized in order to actually help you continue doing that in the form of grants, publications, and so on. Because things beyond that are not considered in the metrics of who's hireable, who's deserving of promotion, are just considered fun, cool things you might be doing for yourself.
Jerry, how about you?
This is related to previous comments. My interest is an academic one in to the extent, measuring the extent to which women are discriminated against in academic science. And one sort of obvious thing you can do is you can compare the citations received for, a measurably equivalent piece of research authored by a woman versus a man, and that gets you only so far. One issue is, how do you find the appropriate counterfactual? It's very difficult using big data to do this. You can use text analysis, and we're getting better and better, I think, at finding measuring the counterfactual. But that still will only give you a kind of lower bound on the degree to which women are discriminated against in science if women are dropping out of their academic careers earlier because they're discouraged. So I think the general issue here is what's captured in the kinds of big data that we use in researching inequities in STEM. And the problem with big data is that, and this is something that comes up in the report, and we discussed this a lot during the conference, is we're just looking under the lamppost. A lot of what's going on is not captured in the kind of big data that we use for these kinds of analyses.
Thank you for that. And I also heard across some of these responses too, that a lot of the way that big data is used tends to use a binary for gender that doesn't represent the whole breadth of gender identities that folks could have, which is a limitation in and of itself. If now we've heard about a couple of ways that it's problematic to use big data and algorithms and how they've perpetuated inequity in different ways, what could or would be different if big data and algorithms were used instead to foster equity in STEM? I'll pass this.
Maria, can you go first on this? I'm going to ask Maria to answer first, please.
Okay. So at the moment, in my perception, equity and STEM and in general is often perceived as, not perceived, but used as a value that people like to talk about, but not necessarily implement. And it can be a value that institutions or organizations say they're committed to without displaying any evidence of that. And I think that acknowledging that biases and equities are inescapable in big data analysis can lead to more intentional data frame construction. For example, making a better effort at actually including populations that are often not included in big data analyses. So one example is what Heather brought up, where gender is just a binary. Other examples can be what labels are used for people's race and ethnicities, because often a lot of groups are aggregated together and there isn't really a good way to know how different groups are doing within STEM in whatever context. So just being more intentional in the construction of the data frames, choosing to represent variables that aren't always included, and confirming trends that are observed in the data. So big data is often used in just a quantitative kind of way, where you just see general trends that aggregate a lot of groups together and don't necessarily focus on less represented groups' experiences. So qualitative data and input are a good way to confirm whether the trends we're observing are actually what's happening for people's lives and experiences. And that can take the form of questionnaire that's more open-ended, or interacting with people within groups that are represented in the big data to see if what the data is saying is actually reflective of people's experiences, or maybe it's more of an aggregate kind of mean that might not actually represent anyone's experiences. So I think the big issue sometimes with quantitative analyses of big data is that whatever the output you receive is kind of taken to be a truth without too much scrutiny, without testing that what it's saying is actually reflective of people's experiences and isn't just an output that you will receive no matter what you do when you have big data. Yeah, so I have a lot of more things to say, but I'll let other people speak as well.
Thank you, Maria. I'm going to ask Jerry to respond to the question. Just to remind the audience, the question is, what would or what will be different if big data and algorithms are used instead to foster equity in STEM? Jerry, how would you respond?
Oh, I'm not sure if this is, let me take a shot at an answer. I don't know if this is quite what we're after here, but I think that there are some pitfalls, but there are also some potential benefits from using big data. So going back to my own research inclinations, I'm very much interested in measuring outcomes by ethnicity and racial category and the intersection of that and gender. And when you're using data that you often find from the government surveys, you're kind of left with very sparse cells. So, you don't have enough. For example, if you're interested in studying the experience of, Black mathematics PhDs using most data sets that the government collects. You just don't have enough data to say anything about that category of, STEM workers. The real big data, it depends on what kind of dimension we're talking about, but data that's really big and broad and captures, the population of mathematicians in the world, that's the kind of data that I'm working with. You can do that sort of analysis. That's an advantage of big data. So there are problems with big data, and there are biases, and you've got to know how the data are generated and what's missing from the data, and how the data is misrepresenting reality. But big data, the reason why it's so wonderful is because you're collecting population or near population data that allows you to do analyses on very small subgroups, like Black mathematics PhDs.
Thanks, Jerry. Beth, how would you answer the question?
Thank you, Joan. So I'd like to pick up on a few of the things that both Maria and Jerry said, but I also want to change a word. What could be different, right? So I think about that in terms of the work that I do, and I'm a mixed methods researcher, so I combine qualitative and quantitative research methods to do a triangulation. So what could be different? We could really enhance the power, the analytical power and the rigor of the textual analyses. I think Jerry and Maria may have mentioned this, or Joan. One of the things that I've noticed is that when we're using the big data for analytical power, we can reveal patterns that are easy to miss. And they're a lot harder to miss when there's that bigger N, when we've got the computer assessment. So from my perspective, I like the big data because it allows us to look more broadly for patterns, both quantitative and qualitative patterns. However, it goes back to the devil's in the detail. So we have to embed particular values into the ways that we do the training, the ways that the raw data are collected. So we have to be really, really careful about that. I think we have the potential to make big data analyses, say, of evaluation or advancement more inclusive by embedding into the algorithms a broader set of ideas and concepts that we include as valorous. So these are all possibilities, but we really need to think about how we can do it fairly and get at the fundamental properties of the data and the training processes that go into the algorithms.
Thank you, Beth. And for the audience, I just want to mention two other kinds of things that our workshop identified as possible future outcomes if big data is used to foster equity instead of perhaps be used with all its warts. First of all is that it will question the whole assumption of objectivity in science. By using data in the right way, we can try to get a little bit closer to what might actually be the underlying biases in our data. And secondly, if we use the data with a big sweep and really probe carefully, we can actually dismantle the illusion of meritocracy. We all live in what we think is a meritocratic system, but of course it's not. It's a human system. So those are just two additional ideas that came through in the report.
Thanks, everyone. During the workshop, we also talked about a variety of different key research areas that we might want to explore. So what are some of the key research areas that would get us closer to that possibility of leveraging big data and algorithms for equity in STEM? What do we need to study and or practice to make this possibility a reality?
Jerry, how about if you go first, take a stab at that one?
One thing I remember we talked about is like, okay, we have this big data and we're uncovering, more precise measures of inequity and STEM. What do we do about it? So I think I remember I was on a committee, a breakout group that was focused on thinking about interventions that we might construct. The way I think about this is that we could think, well, suppose we find that women are having trouble launching their academic careers when they're young because they have children at home, or they have older adults that they're caring for, and so they can't publish at the same rate. Are there sort of interventions that we could couple with big data collection and analysis to think about solutions? For me, that would mean, some devising some kind of, policy intervention and if not an experiment, some kind of quasi-experiment in which, we can construct a counterfactual and scientifically evaluate the intervention and its impacts on careers of, female scientists.
Thanks, Jerry. Beth, how about you?
Sure, thank you. I love this question. And I'm going to pick up on something that Jerry mentioned about the data and doing quasi-experimental studies. So I think from a big data and algorithm perspective, this is fundamentally a basic science question. And what do I mean by basic science? I think that the algorithms that we use to assign gender or assign ethnicity in the big data studies really needs to be improved. There are some algorithms that people are using which are great, but none of them are perfect. And we know that certain types of names, the origins of certain names like Asian names, are notoriously poorly assessed by our algorithms. So in order to be as inclusive and as accurate as possible, we really need that basic science research to be able to apportion appropriately gender, race, ethnicity, and potentially to be able to look at gender in a non-binary way as well. Because these policy suggestions, the underlying data analyses that we use, they're only as good as the data that we put into them. So in the example that I gave about Reuters, misassigned gender and using fundamentally flawed data to come up with the outcomes. So I see that as the biggest problem in being able to move forward. And I would say if anyone's listening from National Science Foundation, really emphasizing that data science so that we get it right and we can be inclusive and as inclusive as possible.
Maria, what would you like to add?
I would like to add something we mentioned briefly before. The data sets often have missing variables, missing values, populations that are not represented or represented in a very coarse kind of manner. For example, in demographic questionnaires that are used often on big data, Black is one category, but it includes people from various backgrounds, continents, language backgrounds, and so on. And this really relates to a big issue with big data that is used by companies for all kinds of automated tools, which is the lack of transparency. So you've mentioned earlier how you have the example of facial recognition algorithms that don't do a good job, which was discovered after it negatively affected many people's lives who weren't white men mostly. And only after that, it was discovered that training data sets used for these algorithms were not sufficiently versatile and inclusive of the population. So this is still an existing issue where big models, big data, algorithms use training data sets that are probably not sufficiently representative of population, but companies are not actually mandated in disclosing what they include, what this is based on. There are all kinds of values that we talk about in panels like this and in academia of how things should be done. and all kinds of manifests that companies and governments write about how things should happen, but no one is actually mandated to do those things. So even if we figure out all the solutions to all the issues, as long as it's all like black box algorithms and no transparency on inclusion and no regulation that mandates companies not to just say they want to be inclusive, but actually show that they are, that's going to be an ongoing issue for sure.
Thank you. I'd like to add one other thing, and that is that most of the data sets that are used, which have equity issues, were not collected for the purpose to which researchers use them. So, for example, citation data are not being published so that somebody can go out and find out who the 100,000 best economists are. That's not why those data were collected in the first place. The data are not collected so that journals can figure out how to ratchet up their citation scores. Data on gender and ethnicity are collected in a particular way, which may have great impact on the way folks self-report. So there's all kinds of biases that are built into the data sets that are not apparent to anybody who's going to be using them. And it's really important for big data scientists to think carefully about how the data were collected, what biases there might be in them, and apportion their effort accordingly.
Thank you. I also know that during the workshop, one of the things that came up as something that's critical to how big data need to be collected to be more inclusive, more equitable, and to get at the role that bias plays is the collection of use of data through an intersectional framework. That came up time and time again throughout our discussion. So I just wanted to raise that to the top as well. And we have one more prompted question before we get to our audience questions. So as you're thinking about questions you might want to ask our panelists, you can start to put those in the Q&A. If you have a question that you're sitting on, don't be shy, feel free to share it. And we'll get to those after this last prompted question. I wanted to preface this question by saying there was a lot of foresight on the part of the ARC team and the research board in raising the topic around big data and algorithms so that we can be proactive in addressing pivotal issues related to intersectional equity in STEM. And this last topic is a prime example of that. So the rise of ChatGPT and AI is something that is a hot topic right now. What are the implications of these new technologies for intersectional gender equity from your perspectives, panelists?
Maria, you want to go first on this one?
Yeah, the thoughts I had on this are not fully specific to gender equity, but are in general relevant to that too. So I think that ChatGPT is similar to existing algorithms that we discussed, where it's an imperfect service that generalizes and provides confident sounding responses based on partial data with missing values, just scrubbing the internet for what can be an answer to a question and structuring it in a way that seems somewhat confident and convincing. The added danger with generative AI tools like ChatGPT and DALL-E, which is related to creation of images, is that they kind of produce their own content that's based on imperfect generalizations and existing biases related with gender or otherwise that we discussed. And the content is partially moderated for damage control for damages that have been identified by people. Mostly that's done by underpaid workers. And it still utilizes people's intellectual property kind of without their consent, like with the example of DALL-E using artists' work to create new art supposedly generated by AI, but actually just taking advantage of what artists have uploaded online and have not necessarily consented to being used in that kind of way. And it kind of produces problematic and sometimes false output. So for example, ChatGPT can generate made-up references that seem really real, weaved between real references. A few academics have tried to just test ChatGPT and like, give me a list of citations on this topic, and between actual studies, there were really made up ones with DOI numbers and everything else. So in all the excitement of this technology developing and people's, it sounds kind of judgmental, but blind trust in that because it's technology, a lot of harm can happen to people's intellectual property, to people's use of this in all kinds of ways. And yeah, that's a bit of stuff I have to say about that.
Beth, why don't you have a go?
Thank you. I was going to say what Maria said, but let me add a few things to what Maria said. One of the, in this question actually brings so many things together all at once, because we're talking about human biases being embedded into the technology. And you know, what does that mean concretely? It means that our stereotypes are getting embedded. We could say for GPT that we want something written in the style of a particular person from a particular background. And so they're going to pull what is a stereotype into that outcome. So I worry a lot about erasing differences, and when differences are apparent in these systems, that they are stereotypical, that they're not sort of actual, that the general responses that we have, that they're predicted, when in reality, we know that most of us are less than predictable, we hope. And the idea of, again, what goes in. So there are standards, who's setting the standards that go into these programs, and how can those standards reflect really the diversity of perspectives, as well as some equitable issues too that come up.
Thanks, Beth. Jerry, you have the last word on this topic.
Yeah, this is an interesting topic. I use ChatGPT and quite a bit, actually. And I think Maria gave a nice overview of the issues with ChatGPT. And Beth chimed in too. And I found the very thing that Maria suggested, which is a lot of hallucination. And it is, in fact, you know, it's basically just it's possibly a large incremental sort of innovation, but it's an innovation in the space of big data and AI. So, you know, all of the issues, as Heather mentioned, I think, that have arisen with the practical application of ChatGPT and other large language models, I think most of those issues, I think we discussed in the workshop that we had, and appear in some form in the draft. So the issue, so ChatGPT is just of a kind, but I should say, so, you know, I'm concerned about ChatGPT too, but just to be kind of a devil's advocate, I do see some advantages. I'm not a particularly well-resourced social scientist compared to some of my colleagues, my high-flying colleagues, but I think ChatGPT has the potential, or large language models more generally has the potential of sort of leveling the playing field, in that I use ChatGPT as a kind of research assistant that I can't pay for because I don't have sufficient grant money, and I do rely on it for literature reviews, and I should say, and also some brainstorming and editing. I don't have resources for an editor. So I think this is something that kind of cuts unevenly across the population of academic scientists, probably hitting women and minorities harder than it, you know, white males, for example. And I think ChatGPT is a resource. I think that the one thing that's arisen is, so we're uncovering these biases and these sort of blind spots. But there are, lots of tutorials now, and there's I would imagine, a fair amount of actually research that will become peer-reviewed that will lead to ways that you can prompt, ChatGPT and these other large language models to produce a less biased kind of picture of reality. And I think you can, to the extent that you think, for example, that publications and citations and referencing is biased, you can do two things. You can go to the academic journals, the peer-reviewed journals, and you can look at, say, a literature review on the effects of discrimination on the male-female wage differential, and you'll be, you'll see a collection of papers that are analyzed there. A lot of those papers will be written by men. If you think that there are women who are unacknowledged in this field, you can use ChatGPT or something like it to correct that by asking ChatGPT to provide you with an alternative list of references in this area written or co-authored by women, just as an example of, I think, the advantages that large language models may afford to the problem of, reducing inequity in STEM.
Beth, I see your hand.
Yeah, I want to push Jerry a little bit because it's a great example. It's wonderful. But we also have a colleague who was at the workshop who was part of an author team that looked at the women authors as missing data. So even if we asked our big data to tell us, okay, what women have published, we're looking at author order, we're looking at whether or not they even made it to the list of authors. So there's so much, and I keep coming back to the underlying data, and that we have to improve the data. And just to throw in, the White House OSTP initiative about data equity is really important, and it should be part of this conversation. And what they're trying to do is make more data available. But as we've all said, we have to make sure that those are good data and the right data, so that we're not making false assumptions or policies based upon inadequate data. We have to keep reminding ourselves about that. So Jerry, did I push you enough to talk about?
No, I mean, I totally agree with everything you said. In fact, that was a point that I brought up earlier. The problem with doing a citation analysis, for example, and analyzing discrimination in science, is that you are getting a lower bound on the degree of discrimination to the extent that it exists and it's discouraging women from publishing in the first place. So no, I totally agree with what you said.
Thank you. And that was our last prompted question. I want to open it up for questions from our audience, and Virginia Rhodes, our ARC Network Project Director, is going to moderate those questions.
Yeah, so it looks like the audience is thinking real hard about everything you guys were saying and is coming up with questions. So in the meantime, a question I have for the panelists is there anything from the workshop that you think of that was not discussed during today's webinar that you'd like to share while we're waiting for the audience here?
I'm going to jump right in because I wanted to say this earlier. There are axes of identity that big data simply do not capture. So, for example, ability status. I myself have a hearing impairment, and I'm rarely asked about that. Gender identity is another one. Sexuality is another one that big data typically does not approach. And there are other axes of identity that big data simply do not capture that are really important to people's lives. So I think we need to keep that in mind when we start talking about equity.
I want to add on that, that these questions are sometimes asked of people. whether they have a disability, what is their sexual orientation, and things of that sort. And I think a big issue based on research I've done and just my intuitions is that a lot of times people are hesitant to share information like that because they don't really know what's going to be done with that. And they have a very legitimate fear of being discriminated for those reasons. It's not really clear who, even if there are specific good intentions that are communicated to the person answering these questions, it's not very clear who will have access to the data. How will that data be used beyond its stated goals? It's just data that's out there about you, and you don't really have control of all of what happens with it, even if you consent to specific use. And we've kind of talked about it with respect to ChatGPT or other generative AI using things from the internet for all kinds of purposes. There's a lot of lawsuits against Facebook, against other companies for just scrubbing data from the internet that people did not consent for sharing in large data models, but are used in that way. So there are some barriers in the collection of better data, even if that's decided as a good thing, even if it's decided that we all need better, less coarse data from people, there's still a trust issue that's very real, and a discrimination issue because human biases are constantly perpetuated by algorithms, by technology, and that will need to be addressed also in a regulatory kind of way of what are the limitations on how data can be used. Can companies leverage data used for one purpose for additional things, and why shouldn't they have that ability? Yeah,
go ahead, Beth.
I'd like to jump in on that. So I think Maria brings up some really important points, and I just want to bring it together and say that we do have the data security concerns that you're talking about, and certain groups have more concerns over data security than others, and this is absolutely correct. And again, that's one of the fundamental data issues that we have to start addressing before we can start using the power and the beneficial power of the big data analyses. Because, you know, I've been doing surveys for a long time. And when you send out a survey to a group of faculty or, you know, STEM faculty, and you want to do an intersectional analysis, if people don't self-identify, then you can't do that intersectional analysis. You can't do really good policy prescriptions, as Jerry was mentioning, because you don't have the data that you need. And so we're always coming up with, well, if the data were such, then we would think of the following policy prescription without really knowing. And in our world and in the academy, we want to know, right? Many of us are scientists. We want to know what the data are. And without that data security, we're just never going to get people to answer the questions that then allow for the intersectional analyses that we need to be able to move forward. So it's one of those problems we have to solve together, a simultaneous equation, if you will.
Great, thanks. We've got a question from Radhika Lisnik, who asks, can you briefly describe the data you analyzed and the research methods that supported the conclusions you shared today?
Sorry, I'm not quite sure. That's a huge question. And I think every one of our participants in the workshop had analyzed different kinds of data sets. So Jerry looks at data from the federal government, correct, data, Jerry? You use a lot of US Department of Labor statistics.
Yes. I think this is a really good question because I'm curious too about, because I have a sort of a general point I want to make at least at the end. So I use federal data, yes. So I use census data, for example. I have, this is, I've got employer-employee data for most of the country, but that just gives me limited information on occupations and measures of productivity and, and whether or not someone's doing STEM work. So for the the actual STEM analysis that I do, most of the STEM analysis I do, I use publication data. For example, I study biomedical scientists, and so I use all of Medline. So Medline is the big database with, all of the publications in or most of the publications in biomedical science. Actually, it's biased. We think we've got most of them, but they may be, the set that we may have is not necessarily representative of the population. And then we do various kinds of text analysis to figure out, which authors are publishing which papers. And we're sort of guessing at who the authors are so that we can create kind of career trajectories. And then we kind of guess at whether they're male or female, or whether they're Black or Hispanic, all of those issues that we've been discussing. So most of my work on women in STEM, for example, is done with data like that.
I would like to add to that. Joan said that everyone came with different specialties. So the specialty that I came with was having done a meta synthesis of the citation research, which is both mixed method. So I come at this from looking at what the data can tell us that goes into the big data sets and what it's not telling us. And so I looked at citation analysis, impact factors, but everyone there had either been creating data sets or using data sets from various perspectives.
Yeah, and my specific experience relates to several points that were brought up in the workshop. So I have done some work with a huge data set of student essays that has really minimal demographic information that's really impeding my ability to draw any conclusions, well, not any, but draw many conclusions about how people's backgrounds affect their writing skills and abilities. So for example, the data set for disability only had a binary variable. For socioeconomic status, it was just socioeconomically disadvantaged or not. So even though it's a huge data set, it's kind of hard to draw conclusions on how these background variables affect people's writing. Another experience I've had is collecting my own data set about demographic data collection and how people identify themselves, which I've done with interviews that gave me a much richer data set on what are people's issues, what options are they missing, what trust issues they have with those questionnaires, and what things they don't want to disclose. So I would say that my research experience and the types of data I've interacted with really supported the idea of using quantitative and qualitative data in tandem to triangulate your findings and to really elaborate on what the quantitative data means. But also the issue of missing values and having to collect better data to be able to interpret what large data sets are showing you. Because if there's a lot of missing values, you're somewhat limited in what you can say about people from that data.
And let me just give two other examples of big data sets that our participants have analyzed. One comes from the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, USPTO. It's showing very clearly that women and inventors of color are underrepresented among those who apply for and receive patents. And then the IPEDS database, which the U.S. Department of Education maintains, has huge databases on who the faculty are, who the students are, what the tuition is across a lot of different institutions. That's been mined by many, many, many scholars.
Great, thanks. It looks like we don't have any more questions from the audience. Do the panelists have any final thoughts they'd like to share before we close out our webinar today?
If I may, I just wanted to make one point. So I was curious as to what data you all are working with, and you and I are working with data that are tracking people basically after they're well on their way in their careers. And so, for example, I use publication data. My publication data, of course, a person doesn't show up in my data if they don't publish. And you publish if you've if you've sort of progressed through a series of hoops, you are on a path to become a PhD in STEM or an engineer. You're on a path from when you're a small child, probably before that. And for example, all the interventions that the NIH and the NSF have looked at to bring to improve equity in STEM are interventions that happen far along in this path, when people are adults. And I think that's a problem with big data and using the big data that we have, or the data that we have generally, in promoting equity. I think this is the normative question, right? This is the reason why we're here, because we're interested in improving equity in STEM. And one important aspect of that, and one important aspect that we discussed, is STEM from the perspective of careers. How do we promote, career equity in STEM? And I think that if we had child psychologists on this panel, they would tell us that, you really have to look at the inequities that are kind of baked in at the beginning of the life cycle, not towards the, early part of the middle life cycle, which is where all of our data is focused. So if the NSF or the NIH is here and they're listening, I think one thing that I believe that we really need is to look, look earlier in the life cycle, not later in the life cycle, if we're interested in promoting STEM and equity in STEM.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you to all of our panelists.